Dear audience, my name is Anna Wigenmark, and I'm the chair of the association, the NGO Ordfront, and I will introduce this afternoon's prize ceremony and seminar to you. I know that amongst you, there are a number of people, or many of you, who are human rights activists. Many of you even sacrifice your own lives to defend people's rights, and some of you have had to leave your countries in doing so. Others have decided to stay and fight at home, still facing the risk of being incarcerated, tortured, threatened in many different ways. You have been here at the Human Rights Forum to give us more knowledge and information about the situation in your country and about the situation for human rights defenders all over the world. I'm deeply impressed and in awe of the work you do, and of your courage and determination to fight for human rights and democracy all over the world. Since 1993, Ordfront has presented an award to an individual or a group that works for democracy and human rights in Sweden. Because it's also in Sweden you need to work for human rights. It's an ongoing struggle everywhere in the world. And Sweden is not a country where just because there are human rights here, you have to stop, you should stop working for it. It's a struggle we have to win over and over again. This year, we have decided to present the award to a person not living in Sweden, but whose work and whose revelations has had an impact all over the world, including in Sweden. It is thus with great pleasure and honor I present to you this year Democracy Prize winner of the Ordfront Democracy Prize, Mr. Edward Snowden. And I also will present Mr. Brian Palmer, I almost forgot your name there, who will lead the prize ceremony and also will facilitate the discussion. So I'll leave the floor to you, Brian.
Thank you, Anna Wigenmark. My name is Brian Palmer, and I'm a social anthropologist from the United States, teaching at Uppsala University here in Sweden. And we have with us Edward Snowden. We may also have Glenn Greenwald joining the discussion, but just now we don't have a connection to him. Edward, have you video conferenced with Sweden before? We're waiting for the sound. It was muted on our end. I think we have it now. Right.
Okay. I've unmuted it. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Have you video conferenced with Sweden before, or visited Sweden?
Not on this scale. I just saw the crowd, and this is really amazing. I cannot thank you enough, all of you, Ordfront and everyone else in Sweden and the human rights community, who's offered support not simply to myself, but to thinking about these issues and thinking about how we can fix and address some of the challenges that have been facing our democracy increasingly as technology advances and becomes more available, becomes cheaper. And we see that being increasingly applied to the surveillance context. It's really an honor to be here, and I've got to thank you for inviting me to speak.
Well, we're so glad to have you with us. And here in this auditorium, we have the students, journalists, other citizens participating in the Swedish Forum for Human Rights, Scandinavia's largest human rights gathering that takes place each year. This event will be 1% ceremony and 99% discussion. First the ceremony. the formal ceremony. Edward Snowden, on behalf of the Swedish Civic Association Ordfront, I hereby present to you the Ordfront Democracy Prize for 2014.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The camera's over there, so I'm not going to do that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So, since we understand that you cannot travel safely to receive the beautiful award certificate, I would just ask that you keep in mind the old adage about gifts, that it's the thought that counts. So,
well, thank you. But hey, let's not rule anything out. I know there's been recent change in government in Sweden. So perhaps not too long from now I'll be able to visit in person. All it takes is a safe passage there.
Mm-hmm. I sure hope so. Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Let me read just a small snippet from the official award citation. Quote, Edward Snowden has insisted that it must be up to an informed citizenry to decide whether they wish to live in a world in which they are constantly monitored by the state. With courage and careful judgment, he has initiated a global debate about surveillance systems that operate beyond democratic control and the rule of law. End quote. I was switching into Swedish there. And now we have the privilege to continue the debate that you have started. And I will ask several questions that my Ordfront friends and I are curious to know about. There may be a time lag in the line due to all the wiretaps, and also simply because the Earth is big, and Edward is in Moscow. The first question concerns the double roles of the NSA and other surveillance agencies. One role is to spy on suspected criminals and terrorists. The other role is to spy on just about everyone else. Journalists, judges, climate change negotiators, and activists, the United States Senate committees, German parliamentarians, heads of state, business companies, ordinary citizens in Sweden and the USA and most other lands. How do these two roles fit together?
We see this becoming more and more of a problem because you have sort of an individual agency within a government or an organization that becomes sort of an institution unto itself. It doesn't have oversight because it says that everything we do, all of our operations, are secret. Even the representatives of the people, our elected officials, they don't have awareness of the operations of these organizations. There may be one member, a prime minister, who reviews their activities. It could be in the United States. We've got a few senators, we've got a few representatives who are authorized to discuss information, but even they don't understand the full extent of the operations. And ultimately what this means is it means the widest body of our representatives have no understanding at the political level of government what the actual executive actions of these government agencies are. They don't know what's happening. And so because of this, we have what are initially developed as foreign intelligence programs. Designed for stopping terrorists, designed for preventing, military incursions over borders, extraordinary powers that are granted often in secret to these organizations. But over time, particularly in the last decade, we've seen an increasing tendency within governments to allow these organizations to expand their mission. In the US, we refer to this as mission creep, where sort of its mission expands out slowly and secretly. We don't know what's happening. And this is dangerous because powers that we would not have authorized our police agencies to use within our own countries against our own citizens are increasingly being used for exactly that purpose. They start out being used outside the borders in situations of extreme threat where we're worried about, somebody bombing a marketplace. And then suddenly we see it being used at home to search for drugs, to search for the associations of people, their political identities. And what's really dangerous is because of the way technology has become cheaper, it has an expanded reach, these things are no longer happening on a targeted basis. For example, we may want to listen to a terrorist's cell phone in Pakistan. We know who this terrorist is. We want to listen to his phone calls, see who he's talking to. That's called targeted surveillance. What we've seen in the last year is the birth of what's called, well, not really the birth, but the explosion of what's called mass surveillance, which is where we monitor the telephone communications of everyone in Pakistan, of everyone in, the Congo, everyone in China, everyone in Russia, and even everyone in Sweden, everyone in Germany, everyone in France, and then eventually everyone in the United States. And this isn't science fiction, this isn't a prophecy, this is happening today. Within the United States, the president himself has appointed review panels to look over his programs that have been authorized to intercept the call records of every citizen in the country. Now, where they have the technical reach to do this differs in place to place, but the reality is the policy is there. And this mission creep is extraordinarily dangerous because we now see it being automated to things such as drones, to airplanes. Just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was I'm not sure if everyone's seen it, there was a newspaper article headlined that American cell phones are being targeted in secret US spy programs. What this means is that we have airplanes in the United States operating domestically that have sensors attached to them that listen to the emanations of our cell phones, the wireless adapter cards in our laptops, our Bluetooth headsets, the hardware addresses in your iPod or your iPhone. All of these things have what's called a universally unique identifier, a UUID. And that means once they find out where you've been 3 times in the day, for example, your home, where you work, and where you study, where you go to worship, where you go to vote, anything that can be traced back to you, your friends, your associations, they can then recognize, based on a very small amount of information, such as 3 places you've been, that this hardware address is your iPhone. And then when these planes are circling around our cities, and again, this was reported yesterday, this isn't prophecy, they can track all of your locations because you sit here in your office. As the plane orbits you, it hears your cell phone at multiple locations on that orbit. And based on that, it can triangulate your location. It can track your movements on an increasing and basically permanent scale based on the cost of storage, based on how widely they want to use this. And this is really dangerous because we go, how did this happen? It wasn't authorized by law in the United States. There was no public debate about this. It happened in secrecy. In fact, when the journalists who reported this story went to the government, and they said, what is this? Why is this happening? Can you explain why it needs to happen? Can you justify this intrusion into our rights? Because it's extreme and it's unjustified. And the government said, we can't say that this program exists or that it does not exist. We can't defend it and we can't say that it's necessary because to do so would acknowledge that the program exists. And this is critical because we've got branches of government where we rely on the checks and balances, the friction between the court system, between the executive agencies, the police, the investigators, and between our legislature. And what happens is we have basically organizations and politicians shutting us out of the court system. They're taking the public out of the decision-making process in the elections by saying that we don't need to know about these programs, they're secret, telling us about them will damage national security. And then once they're implemented, if our rights are violated by the programs, typically we would go to the courts, we would make our case, the government would make their case, and then we would actually have the judges decide, is this right, is this proper, does it respect rights? By denying the programs even exist, but refusing to say that they don't exist at the same time, they can tell the courts that they don't have the jurisdiction to rule on these programs. They can't consider the question of whether our rights were violated at all. And this is a critical fact of the revelations of last year that many people didn't understand. They thought about it as only being about surveillance. And surveillance is a massive issue, particularly when we talk about the fact that it's happening on an untargeted basis. It's happening en masse. We're no longer watching criminal suspects, we're watching entire populations. But the reality is that surveillance was only the mechanism of understanding for this new and novel change in the model of government in Western and liberal societies where we never would have expected this activity to occur previously. And this is where we are losing the ability to actually shape and guide the policies of our governments, the ideas that we have, where we say the line should be drawn around the boundaries of our rights. And necessarily as a result of this, we become less self-directing, less liberal, and less free. And I think that's something that we need to resist at every turn. And particularly, there's one thing that was not well understood about the story that came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about these planes suddenly monitoring all of our communications, where we're going, is the fact that, as I said before, this is a program operating domestically within the borders of the United States. But it turned out it was actually reported in February of this year. The Department of Justice has no reason to say this program doesn't exist because it was already revealed with our own documents, with the National Security Agency's own documents, where this program was a foreign intelligence program intended to track terrorists. That's why it was authorized to exist. And they literally called it shenanigans, a word for trickery, a word for deception, a word for a kind of nefarious activities. This program was used to fly around huts in the desert in Yemen. And we said this was for a necessary purpose, to keep our nation safe. And inevitably, only a few short years later, without any authorizing law, without any awareness of the public, without any public debate or any political discussions, we see that that same program that was authorized to hunt terrorists is now hunting small-time criminals at home in our own cities. But it's affecting all of us. All of our communications are now being intercepted. All of our locations are now being monitored simply as a product of using these programs in new and novel ways. And we have to guard against that.
Thank you for that. I want to... I want to zero in for a moment on the people who are doing this information gathering and have access to the information, the workers at the various surveillance agencies. How do your former colleagues and people working in this branch see themselves? What are their typical self-perceptions?
So this is a fairly controversial topic. Many are interested in it, and they ask about, how does this happen? How can we have organizations that are basically limiting the rights of free societies? They're directly undermining the amount of liberty within a society without all of the employees saying this is wrong. And of course, these agencies aren't staffed with evil people. And that's really the answer there. Is none of the people working in these organizations are trying to do a bad thing. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Everyone at the NSA that I work with believed they were doing a good thing. They believe they're going to work every day and they're trying to keep us safe. They're trying to protect us from serious threats out there. The problem is twofold. First off, no one at the NSA, no one at these secret organizations has the full big picture of what are the consequences of their actions. And this is a result of secrecy. When you work in one office at the NSA, you're not supposed to know what someone's doing in the office down the hallway. You're not supposed to know necessarily what the person at the desk next to you is working on. You only see your tiny part of the puzzle. So you do your piece, and you don't see that it's interacting with another person's piece, and another person's piece, and another person's piece, to create this gigantic net that has consequences that you did not foresee and that you have no awareness of. But ultimately, more fundamentally, we have to understand that good people can do bad things for the right reasons. When we think about you know, the former republic in East Germany, when we think about the Stasi, when we think about any state surveillance programs, any state security bureaus, the KGB, things like that, that has existed in the past, these organizations were created in societies that perceived themselves to be under threat, and in many cases they were right. They were facing pressure from external forces, from adversaries, and they thought protecting the state was the most important thing that they could do to provide for the lives and the political control of their societies. They didn't sign up to violate people's rights, but that's what they ended up doing. And it's very much the case here. Now, the NSA is not the Stasi, that's clear. But the reality is they have created a system of surveillance that is far beyond what any previous surveillance society could have ever dreamed about. They have more access to our private lives, to our private records, who we love, what we read about, who we vote for, what we're interested in, what we want to be, than any organization in the history of mankind has ever had before. And that's a tremendous amount of power to invest in any organization. And it becomes markedly more dangerous when this happens without any public control, without any public oversight. Now, one of the things that I would tie in with the previous example about the airplanes traveling around was these programs only work if, for example, the terrorist in question uses a cell phone. If he uses an internet machine that has a wireless internet adapter, something that emanates, that sends radio signals out into the world. All of us as citizens do. But the reality is Osama bin Laden had not used a cell phone since 1999. People have said, you know, maybe these disclosures will make us less safe, maybe terrorists will change their tactics, but anyone who's trying to do some kind of nefarious activity, they know that if they engage in electronic communications, they're very likely to be monitored. So we're creating systems for the purpose of monitoring people who we simply can't monitor because they're not participating in technology to this level, but they are perfect for monitoring us as a public civil society, and that's what we need to watch out for. And when we talk about the fact of how does this come to pass, how do my coworkers feel about themselves, they feel that they're simply preventing terrorist attacks. They feel that they're preventing harm to other people, and they try their very best in their own minds to protect our rights as best they can while still pursuing what they consider the mission.
Mm-hmm. I believe you when you say that most people in the industry are honest and decent. Still, you have described, say, how surveillance workers secretly take pictures of ordinary citizens using their own smartphones or computers. And you have noted that your former colleagues sometimes sent around the office interesting naked pictures of citizens obtained by espionage just for the fun of it. So I want to ask, what kind of workplace culture do we have here? What is the level of professional ethics inside the NSA and accompanying companies?
It's a little bit of a boys' club. When you think about how this happens, you don't want to think about it as this individual is specifically trolling for nude pictures of a particular individual, although this has happened in the past. In fact, NSA analysts have abused these activities, their capabilities to intercept private people's emails, their phone conversations, their attachments, their images and things like that on their accounts, so many times that they have an internal name for it called LoveInt, meaning love intelligence. I think more than 12 people have been openly declared to Congress in the United States as having violated the law and used NSA capabilities to do this. And interestingly, not a single one of them, as far as I understand, has been prosecuted for it, because they consider the secrecy of the programs to be more important than the social interest in justice in deterring individuals from doing this kind of thing in the future. They think that simply having your privacy violated, having a man at the NSA, you know, pass around pictures of your naked body is really no concern of yours. But as to how it happens and what it says about it, it's not that they see this as harmful at all. They assume that you will never know that it happened. And so because of that, it does not affect you at all. They'll be watching, for example, a target, possibly even a legitimate target, But his girlfriend is in conversation with him. She sends him private messages that are sexual in nature, revealing photographs of herself. They have some kind of intimate exchange via a webcam. The analyst who is monitoring them at NSA witnesses this and simply spins around in his chair to the other gentlemen who are working alongside of him, many of whom are very young. We're talking 18 to 20-year-old military assignees to these surveillance agencies, because they often operate under sort of military context. And it says, hey guys, get a look at this. You know, have you seen this before? And this is against the rules officially, but the reality is you are seen as comrades. There's a code of silence because you see so many disturbing things all day long. You're privy to so many secrets that you become sort of a natural conspiracy. And this isn't to say that they set out with nefarious purposes, but it's natural to them. It's their atmosphere. It's the air they breathe. And human nature is such that, and we've seen this from psychological experiments in the past, when you invest ordinary people with unnecessary authority to react and respond in disproportionate and unnecessary ways to threats that aren't particularly significant, they will abuse that power, if only out of boredom. And that's a very dangerous thing. And that's why we need to have oversight. We need to have accountability for individuals who do the wrong thing. And most importantly, this has to start at the top. We cannot simply punish workers at the lowest level when something goes wrong. We have to punish the very senior officials who allowed this environment, who allowed this culture, who allowed this situation, these systems, to be built and operated without the consent of the public in the first place.
Thank you. How can ordinary people, journalists, people in grassroots organizations protect themselves from state surveillance? I prepared for this interview with you using Gmail, Facebook, Dropbox, Skype, and now Google Hangout. In trusting the security of these services, was I a complete idiot?
I wouldn't say you're an idiot, but I would say I have some bad news for you. One of the earliest revelations of the last year was something called the PRISM program. And you mentioned Facebook, you mentioned Skype, Google, all of these companies, the most important American service providers, have been subverted in secret by these organizations. And this is not unique to the United States. The United States does it to the greatest and most abusive extent when it comes to this, because these organizations are headquartered, they're incorporated in the United States, so they have more clout. But the reality is, any service provider nowadays often faces this kind of pressure. What's dangerous about using Google, about using Facebook, about using Dropbox, is that they have access to the content of your communications. They're stored completely unencrypted. Your mailbox that you don't have at home when you log into Gmail is on a Google server somewhere out there in their data centers. Until they adopt a technological scheme called zero-knowledge encryption, where they hold data for you, but they cannot read it themselves, it is going to be vulnerable to this kind of abuse, where the company itself can read it, they can analyze it for revenue activities, they can try to sell it to advertisers, or they can simply provide it to your adversaries, whether they happen to be in a government, if you are a freedom of information activist, if you live in a repressive regime. These governments could pressure these companies and say, we're going to revoke your operating license unless you play ball and provide us this kind of information. And that's a very dangerous thing. Even in the United States, where I believe most people would agree we have a fairly well-developed system of laws, it's extraordinary because the PRISM program that allows Google and Facebook and all of these people to turn over information to these state security bureaus, it operates without warrants. You know, there was a lot of confusion and controversy about this because warrants are used in some cases, but warrants are only used when they're pursuing the information about a U.S. citizen. If you live in Baltimore and the FBI wants to get your information out of Google, they send Google a warrant. But if you're Swedish, they don't need a warrant. They don't even need to show probable cause that they suspect you're involved in a crime. There's a special authority under the FISA Amendments Act of 2008 in the United States called Section 702. And this allows the Attorney General of the United States to secretly create a certification, an authorization for an entire class of search. And this can be anything related to, say, foreign intelligence, which is extraordinarily broad. That's the same authority that's used, for example, spying on Angela Merkel, or the United Nations Children's Fund, or the World Bank, or any of these other organizations, or climate conferences, if you're a climate activist. This same authority can be used to steal your email, and it's not really stolen because Google has to hand it over willingly, from these companies without the showing of a warrant, without showing the suspicion of any crime. And this is an extraordinary subversion of the process of laws, particularly because if you are one of the 95% of human beings who live beyond the borders of the United States, you have been placed in a very vulnerable position, and you have no ability to protest. You have no ability to push back besides not using these services. And these are some of the most important communication services that exist today. So what we really need is we need more international standards. We need more of an international agreement on where the line should be drawn, on the fact that any kind of surveillance must be done on an individual basis that is both necessary, it is restricted to being necessary and proportionate to the threat prevented by this individual. Orders must be provided by a judge on the basis of a judicial warrant. And we don't deviate from these except in times of total war, where we are facing an existential crisis to the entire body of the citizens. And to date, we don't have that. The good news is that we see things beginning to change, even if it's somewhat slow. I believe earlier in the year, the European Court of Justice struck down the data retention directive in the European Union and said that laws that demand by default the kind of data retention that's being abused in this case by Google, by Facebook, by telecommunications providers, who are actually far more responsible for the violation of our rights than any individual technology provider. I'm talking about AT&T, I'm talking about Verizon, I'm talking about the national telecommunications providers in Sweden, in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, in Germany. These organizations we have to depend on to protect the privacy of our communications on a broad collective and social level. And increasingly we see that being violated. But it is a very good sign that courts are beginning to push back and say, without any sort of nuance, without any sort of half measures, mass surveillance, the untargeted surveillance of entire populations without the involvement of judges, without the involvement of orders that say this particular individual is suspected of this particular criminal activity, are a fundamental violation of basic human rights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. We welcome also the journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. Glenn, I think you're in California. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear us there in California, where I guess it's about 6 in the morning? 5 in the morning?
I'm actually in Brazil.
Oh, you're in Brazil, okay.
Yeah, so it's more reasonable. It's 11:30, and yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're just in the middle of the discussion with Edward, and what I'll do is continue with the questions and then ask Edward to comment and then ask you to comment, if that's okay, for you to sort of hop in midstream here.
Oh, sure. What, you mean it started already?
Yeah.
I see.
We started about half an hour ago.
Oh, so I'm late. I apologize. All right, yeah, I'm just going to need about 2 minutes, and then I will be ready. So I will be listening as you do it.
No problem at all. We're just grateful to have you with us, and we'll speak soon then.
Great.
Yeah, but back to you, Edward. Any tips on what services to use instead of Gmail and Hotmail and all of these?
There are a number of alternatives that are privacy preserving to at least some extent, but the reality is it's very difficult to stay completely anonymous online. It's almost an impossible task. In many cases, it is an impossible task. That is slowly changing because we see the development of new tools. We see the development of new social structures that are making that more possible. I could list companies that do a much better job. For example, Dropbox has a direct competitor called SpiderOak that uses the same kind of zero-knowledge encryption that I mentioned previously, where they hold your information just as Dropbox does. They do the exact same thing, only they don't have the keys to provide your information to advertisers or to someone else. So your information is safe not just from external forces, but also from the company itself. And this is an important change. There are encrypted messaging systems now available on your Android phone, on your iPhone, created by a group called Open Whisper Systems, which is different, by the way, from the Whisper service. It's just called Whisper, which is not to be trusted at all. They completely violated privacy. But Open Whisper Systems provides communications platforms like Text Secure, like Redphone, anything by Moxie Marlinspike. These are good and solid. Nothing is perfect, but they're much better. And all you have to do is download the app on your phone, and you can send text messages just as you always have. You can make phone calls just like you always have. But now it can no longer be monitored by third parties. This is the beginning of what we see the future looking like. Today, for me personally, I am not able, simply by virtue of my situation, to communicate the same way everybody else does. I can't use the normal products and services that are completely open and unavailable because I'm being targeted by a number of governments for some kind of retaliation. And so because of this, everything I do has to be encrypted. Now, this is very difficult for me today because the tools are very crude. They're still being developed. But the reality is my present, which is juggling all of these difficult encryption tools, is your future, unless we look at this in a more fundamental way, which is we need to require regulation. We need to require international standards on how we're going to protect communications, not simply within our domestic national legal frameworks, but internationally in the standards that underlie our technology, our communication systems. Because, for example, if you sit in Sweden and you trust the Swedish government would never do anything to harm you, they are completely protective of your individual and collective rights, and they are the most enlightened government in the universe. This may or may not be true, but assuming that the Swedish government can do no wrong, your communications are still at risk as soon as they depart the borders of Sweden, which happens every time you use an online service, which happens every time you visit a website, which happens every time you make a voice over IP call. And so the only way to ensure that your communications are protected the same at home as they are once they cross into China, as when they cross into Norway, as when they cross into Germany or the United Kingdom or the United States or Latin America or anywhere else in the world, is to ensure that our technical standards, which can be enforced across borders regardless of what the laws of a given nation say, protect our rights where letters on a page simply can't do anything. That's the direction we need to be moving in, and that's going to require support for technical research organizations, funding for academic and scientific research into new and better ways of protecting anonymity, of encrypting messages in a secure and robust and reliable way, and having a simple debate where we go, how do we draw the lines around society where we can ensure that collectively all of our communications are secure, while still providing some capability for the police to do their work in the context of targeted investigations. And the good news is this already exists, and it has for years. I mean, when I worked at the NSA, we would break open encrypted phones, encrypted computers every day. And that's not by breaking the encryption itself, but by exploiting the machine. And as long as a judge is involved, as long as we can get a showing of probable cause, that we have evidence showing to a judge that this person is more likely than not to be involved in serious criminal activity, these are things that we as a society can create frameworks for and make sure that these capabilities exist. It's not a choice between privacy and sort of safety. What we are choosing between is security of all of our communications, security of our economies, security of our products and services, and mass surveillance. We do not need mass surveillance. We've seen these systems have been built. But when we look at investigations in the United States, where these panels were appointed by the president himself, they had every incentive to exonerate these programs and say they're effective, they do great things, gave the panels full access to classified information so there could be no question of whether or not they couldn't see this or that. They knew everything. They found that systems of mass surveillance, even though they've been operating for more than 10 years in the United States, had not been instrumental in stopping even a single terrorist attack in more than a decade of operation. And if that's the case, we have to ask, why are we giving up our rights for programs that are not effective, not necessary, and not a part of a kind of world that any liberal society would want to live in?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glenn, we're glad to have you with us too. And this next question is to both of you about Sweden, where this award is being given. We have learned from the two of you and others that Sweden is an eager participant in America's global surveillance network, often in collaboration with the British. Why Sweden? How central is this country's involvement? And also, would Sweden become even more enmeshed in these systems if the country were in the future to join NATO? Maybe I could ask Edward if you want to first say a word, and then Glenn.
I'll actually let Glenn take this one first, since he's then Glenn, would you like to take that one?
Sure, Ed's obviously been doing a lot of work, and so I guess it's time for me to do a little. Let me just quickly apologize for my less than elegant appearance in the middle of the event. There was some miscommunication. No
problem at all. We're just glad to have you.
All right, great. So, we were able to do a good amount of reporting in Sweden. And the reason for that is because Sweden is indeed an extremely active participant in what has become known around the world as this mass surveillance system that is led by the United States, and it's for principal partners, but has a lot of other instrumental partners around the world, a leading one of which, in fact, is the Swedish agency. And, one of the benefits, I think, of the reporting that we were able to do is that we worked with Swedish journalists, and so had a really good understanding of what the significant parts of the reporting was. And one of the things they said from the beginning was that there was a clear inconsistency, an enormous inconsistency, in fact, between the claims that the Swedish government has been making to the Swedish public about things like non-NATO membership, meaning that there's neutrality, and the reality of what Sweden is doing in the world, which is using its surveillance capabilities and other instruments of military and foreign power on behalf of the United States, very much as a kind of vassal of the United States, serving the interests of the United States, based on the perception that it serves the interest of Sweden as well. So I don't know how much worse it could get or how much more extreme it could get if Sweden actually joined NATO. I think that's almost more a matter of symbolism at this point. And ultimately, I think this is one of the most important parts of the reporting that we've been able to do as a result of the heroic acts of Edward Snowden. There's obviously has been revealed surveillance and privacy, but I ultimately think that the bigger issue is not the threat posed to privacy, but the threat posed to democracy by all of the things that we've been able to reveal. And so here you have a whole variety of governments, including the Swedish government, which, whatever your views are on the wisdom of the policies, they've engaged in some extraordinarily consequential programs to gather the capabilities to amass enormous amounts of surveillance data about what we're all doing on the internet. And yet it was all done without a whiff of disclosure or debate democratically by the citizenries who are supposed to be holding these governments democratically accountable. But the Swedish citizenry is happy having a government that has the capabilities to gather not thousands, but hundreds of millions of communication events every month, or even more, or is happy having the Swedish side with the United States against Russia and other adversaries this aggressively. That's something that ought to be debated openly. It doesn't mean that every detail has to be disclosed, and of course we haven't disclosed every detail, but it certainly means that the broad sense of what our government's doing that are the most consequential ought to be known to us rather than concealed. And that hasn't been the case in Western democracies, including Sweden. And I think the Snowden reporting has demonstrated that as much as it has any other point.
Thank you. Edward, anything to add on that question?
I would say, I think the key point is, and I won't speak for Sweden, I think that's a question for the public in every country to consider for their own purposes. But being a neutral country is a fairly extraordinary and rare thing. It's a very important thing to say we are not going to be a militarist nation. We're not going to be sort of the perpetuators of a state of conflict, of a state of sort of active combat against all of our peers on the world stage. And we're not going to develop these systems of violence, these systems of power, these systems of projecting control around the world, whether those are about launching missiles or whether those are about monitoring people's private lives. This is a debate that is very important, and if you have established a neutrality, it's very important that you consider the consequences, the costs of keeping it, and what it brings to you, to your lives, to those around you, and to the world more generally, if we're tilting away from a pacifist foreign policy into an aggressive foreign policy. Further, I would say when we talk about the activities of surveillance and monitoring in Sweden, the FRA, the Swedish Signals Intelligence Agency, this group is engaged in the same kind of activity that we see throughout the EU and throughout the world when we're talking about the US sort of monitoring framework, the Western intelligence apparatus, where there is kind of an arbitrage of jurisdictions that we need to be very cautious about, where the NSA will say to Sweden, we promise we will not monitor Swedish citizens within Sweden. And they may say we won't monitor them outside of Sweden. But the reality is, as soon as your communications have crossed from a technical monitoring site run by the NSA in Sweden, across the cable to Denmark, across the cable to Germany, and everywhere else, the technical protections change. And suddenly that information is being ingested. Your private records are being stored in databases in all of these countries that should be allied simply as a consequence of the fact that they exist. And it is not easy to say, you know, when you use the internet, there is no citizenship checkbox that says where you're using this, that, and the other. So as a natural consequence, you are losing a significant amount of privacy and ultimately liberty. You are losing a significant measure of control over how you interact with the world and what these gigantic organizations, adversaries, and corporations know about you simply by engaging in these partnerships. And there needs to be the question asked about, is this necessary? Is this wise? And is this ultimately what a liberal democracy wants for themselves and for the future of our world?
How can, the question to both of you, how can ordinary people help restore democratic control to rein in these surveillance apparatuses? What steps can we take? What organizations should we consider supporting in Sweden, internationally, to try to bring about these reforms?
I would say fundamentally, we have to focus on demanding accountability for officials who are involved in these programs as well as accountability of the programs themselves. We as the public cannot exercise any meaningful control over the activities of our government if we don't know what they are. I mean, that's a basic point that governments today are refusing to argue. They're saying, we can't tell you about these programs because if you know about them, they will no longer be effective. And yet we still catch criminals on telephone wiretaps that have existed since the very early 1900s. We know for a fact that these claims are not true, because if I am a criminal involved in some kind of a nefarious activity, I have two choices. I can either choose to coordinate with external peers and risk monitoring, or I can choose to act on my own and significantly decrease my capability. And what we see is often criminals, regardless of the dangers, particularly because criminals are not the most bright and rational people to begin with, they tend to make the less safe choices. And they tend to go, hey, I'm going to talk to all of my friends and steal someone's shoes and then post about it on the internet. And so regardless of whether or not these capabilities are known, they will still be effective to some extent. And we will have other capabilities that will be effective regardless as technology advances, because what we need to understand about intelligence agencies is they do not have a finite source. They do not have finite sources of intelligence. They are factories that produce sources of intelligence on a constant basis. We create new techniques. We create new methods for gathering intelligence as a natural consequence of putting a ton of very smart, very motivated people in a room and telling them to solve a hard problem. So I would say that the key is accountability of government and accountability to the public for what these programs are. And ultimately, we have to demand that courts have the political courage to make the hard decisions about difficult cases when it has an impact on where the boundaries of our rights are being decided, particularly when secrecy and particularly when national security are put forward as arguments. The idea of a state secrets privilege is fundamentally incompatible with liberal democratic societies.
And Glenn, the same question. What initiatives, organizations can ordinary citizens be part of to reform this system?
Well, interestingly, there has been this split. If you look at how governments have responded to this reporting versus, say, how large internet companies have responded. So in the United States, for example, there were polls overwhelmingly showing for the first time since 9/11 that people fear the government's assault on their civil liberties much more now than they fear external terrorism. The first time there has been polling results like that since 9/11, which came about as a result of the reporting we were able to do. And there's hundreds of millions of people or tens of millions in the United States who are very, very alarmed by and opposed to these programs. And yet there's been no law thus far passed in the United States to limit even the most extreme programs that we were able to report, because there really is this huge disconnect between the views of citizenry and these certain governments. But what has been really promising, and I think there will be some laws passed ultimately, but they won't be very significant. But what has been really promising is the way in which the large companies like Facebook and Yahoo and Google now realize that their future viability depends upon a serious commitment to protecting the privacy of their users' communication. Obviously, these companies don't have any real interest in the privacy of their users. They were more than happy to fully collaborate with the internet when they thought they could get away with doing it because nobody knew they were doing it. But now that it's known what they were doing, and it's known the extent to which people's privacy is being compromised, there is a serious movement globally to demand that these companies protect rather than subvert and override the privacy of their users. And they're really petrified that in the future, if they don't do that, people are going to say, I'd rather use a German social media company or a Brazilian or a Korean one rather than Facebook and Google, because I don't trust these companies to safeguard my information. And they're now taking serious steps because they're forced by their customers to do things like put encryption onto new products, and provide other privacy protecting technologies. And I think this is a crucial pressure point. I mean, if you're somebody who cares at all about your privacy, you should certainly be doing things like using basic tools of encryption to protect your email, or things like the Tor browser to protect your online activities. Those things really work. They're not perfect, but they do put a real wall between the government and their efforts at surveillance. But even more important, simply don't use those companies that have proven that they will violate your privacy. Use the companies that are making a real demonstration that they will protect your privacy. And that will not only reward the companies that are doing that and punishing those who are turning data over to these governments, but it'll put enormous amounts of pressure, the kind of pressure that matters to these companies, which is their bottom line, to start to take privacy very seriously and to resist government encroachments into people's privacy. And I think that's something that individuals around the world can do very, very powerfully.
Thank you. As we're coming to the end of our time, a final brief question to each of you. These have been a very intensive 18 months for both of you since the beginning of the revelations. How have the past 18 months changed you as a person? What have you learned about life during this period? It's a broad question to ask for a short answer, but I'd just be interested to hear.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that first, and so leave the final word to Ed. There's a lot I've learned, but I'll just give you one lesson that for me has been among the most significant that will, I think, affect me and how I look at things for the rest of my life, which is that when I got to Hong Kong, I met somebody who at the time was 29 years old, who had no real power or position or prestige of any kind, and had decided to essentially unravel his entire life and risk everything in our lives that we genuinely value in pursuit of all of the rights of all of us, the privacy rights of all of us, and to do something about a profound injustice that he believed he had confronted. And through nothing more than an act of conscience, literally just a very principled act of conscience, he was able to change the world, to literally change the world. And I think it's an incredibly powerful testament to the power of individuals to subvert and undermine injustice, even when it comes from the most powerful government on earth. And I think it should be a reminder to all of us that defeatism, or this idea that we don't have the power within us to change things, is always a mythology. History is full of Edward Snowdens, people who are very ordinary, who through extraordinary behavior do a great deal of good for the world. And I think and I hope that it will inspire huge numbers of people the way that it inspired me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. That's some heavy stuff there, but thank you very much. I would say for me, I've changed so much, and I've learned so much. I mean, my politics have changed, my worldview has changed as a consequence of the events of what happened and come beyond. When I stepped forward and decided that I had to act, that I had a moral obligation, and more importantly, that I had a civic duty to my family, to my peers, to everybody who shares the country that I live in, that some wrongdoing must be opposed. We have to stand up and say something about it if we believe in it. We can't simply say this is wrong internally. We have to stand and protest. We have to stand and be counted. We have to stand up and say, I will do whatever I can. I will pay for things to make a difference happen. And I did lose a lot. I can't return home now. But I have gained so much more. I have a tremendous sense of satisfaction in the work that I've been able to participate in the response from people, because ultimately what I learned is in Hong Kong, the journalist Glenn asked me, what is your greatest fear? What are you worried about? And I said that nothing will change that people will not care, and that we will simply look away because it is too much to consider. It would cause us to despair. But the reality of the response has been enormous. And much like we've seen with technology, technology is an amplification of individual power. It's what allows us to reach beyond borders, to think and to share and to create and to build communities and to build better societies. But it amplifies government power of control and invasion and intrusion in the same way. Principle amplifies that same kind of activity. Courage amplifies that same kind of activity. And when one person stands up and says, yes, I am afraid, but I will stand up anyway, we see the entirety of the world can pay attention and stand up alongside them, and things will change. Together, we can change everything simply by saying, no, there is a level of incivility and inhumanity that I can tolerate as an individual. I can tolerate as a member of a community, but there is a bright line beyond which I will no longer be a part of wrongdoing. And I think last year for myself and many others around the world, we saw that line. Together, we've stood to stand up. And while we've done much, there's still so much more to be done, but together, I think we can make it happen. And we can say that the loss of privacy is not inevitable. The loss of liberty is not inevitable. The loss of control over our governments, over our policies, over the world we live in is not inevitable. It is a choice, and it is a choice that together we can make.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Neither of you like to be called a hero, and I will try to respect that. But as an anthropologist who studies moral courage, I just note that the individuals the world most admires, people like Rosa Parks on the bus in Montgomery, or Malala Yousafzai speaking up against the Taliban, these individuals are usually those who show, as Gloria Steinem put it, the courage to make themselves vulnerable. And you two in your work have both shown the courage to make yourselves vulnerable. Our time has run out, and from this chilly corner of northern Sweden, I want simply to say to the brave journalist Glenn Greenwald and to the new winner of the Ordfront Democracy Prize, Edward Snowden, we thank you.